Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into the Victorian era. That magical time when Britain ruled half the world while pretending sex didn't exist, and Queen Victoria mourned her husband for 40 years, like it was a competitive sport. The era of empire, industry, and industrial strength hypocrisy, where people built railways and orphanages with equal enthusiasm, convinced they were civilizing the world while mainly just exploiting it. So before we begin this journey through corsets, coal mines, and colonial violence dressed up as progress, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy history delivered with the appropriate amount of sarcasm. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Because apparently we're a global community of insomniacs and history nerds, which honestly explains a lot. Now settle in, maybe brew some tea since we're talking about the British. And prepare yourself for a deep dive into an era that gave us everything from Darwin's evolution to Jack the Ripper, from the Industrial Revolution to the invention of childhood, all while being ruled by a 5-foot-tall widow who outlived everyone's patience. So you think the Victorian era had kings? That's precious. Truly adorable, like asking which president ruled during the American Revolution. There was one monarch during the Victorian era, and spoiler alert, the clue's in the name. But since you asked about kings, we're going to talk about the entire messy Hanoverian dynasty that preceded her, the prince consort who wasn't technically king, and all the royal dysfunction that came after. Because apparently we need to understand how a German family that couldn't speak English ended up ruling Britain, while everyone pretended this made perfect sense. Buckle up. This is going to take a while, and by a while, I mean we're settling in for the long haul. We're talking about the Georges, all of them. About William the Sailor King, about Victoria's 40-year mourning period, about Edward VII waiting 6 decades to inherit, and about how British monarchy survived by becoming increasingly irrelevant while maintaining it was absolutely essential. We're covering empire, industry, exploitation, and how the Victorians convinced themselves they were bringing civilization to the world, when mainly they were bringing violence, resource extraction, and really confident racism backed by fake science and actual guns. We're talking about the gap between Victorian morality and Victorian reality, between what they claimed to believe and how they actually behaved. Between the gleaming museums they built with wealth stolen from colonies they claimed to be civilizing. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe prepare some snacks because we're going to be here for a minute. And let's explore how one era shaped modernity while being deeply, fundamentally wrong about almost everything, and how we're still living with the consequences of their certainty that they knew best how everyone else should live. Let's begin. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. There was exactly one monarch during the Victorian era, and spoiler alert, it wasn't a king, it was Victoria, Queen Victoria. The era is literally named after her, but you asked about kings, so we're going to talk about the kings who came before her, the king who didn't exist during her reign, because she outlived everyone's patience, and the kings who came after, presumably while you were hoping for some dramatic tale of Victorian monarchy that doesn't actually exist in the way you imagined it. But here's what we can do. We can talk about the Hanoverian dynasty, the messy family tree that gave us Victoria, the kings who preceded her, and the absolute soap opera of succession, madness, fashion crimes, and political incompetence that characterized the British monarchy from the moment the Germans showed up and pretended to care about England. We'll discuss the Georges, all 4 of them plus a bonus William, and then we'll talk about what came after Victoria. Because apparently we need 20,000 words of this, and I'm going to earn every single one of them, while maintaining this aggressively sardonic tone that makes history sound like a particularly unhinged dinner party where everyone's related, and someone's definitely getting disinherited. So buckle up. We're starting with George I, a man who couldn't speak English, didn't want to be in England, and yet somehow became King of England. The universe has a sense of humour, and it's mostly cruel. The year is 1714. Queen Anne just died, bloated and exhausted after producing approximately 17 dead children and 0 live heirs. The start line, dramatic to the last, has finally sputtered out like a candle in a drafty palace. Now, England needs a new monarch, and according to the Act of Settlement from 1701, that monarch needs to be Protestant, not Catholic, definitely not Catholic. England had opinions about Catholicism, most of them negative, all of them violent. So who's next in line? Well, if you go by pure blood proximity, there were about 50 Catholic relatives with better claims. But Catholicism was a deal-breaker, so Parliament looked down the family tree, past all the Catholics, until they found George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover. He was Victoria's great-great-grandfather, and he was about as English as Schnitzel. George spoke German. He thought German. He dreamed in German. England was, to him, a questionable career move that paid well. But George was Protestant, and in early 18th century England, Protestant trumped literally everything else, including competence, likability, or the ability to speak the language of the country you're about to rule. So in August 1714, George arrived in England with 2 mistresses, both nicknamed by the cruel English public. One was tall and thin, so they called her the Maypole. The other was large, so they called her the Elephant. Romance was different back then. By different, I mean people were horrible. George I didn't like England, and England didn't like him back. It was a mutual dislike society with crowns. He spent as much time as possible in Hanover, his actual home, where people spoke his language and didn't make fun of his mistresses quite so publicly. When he had to be in England, he looked miserable, which, fair enough. Imagine being imported to manage a country you didn't ask for, filled with people who resent you for not being the person they actually wanted. George's reign was marked by his aggressive disinterest in British politics. He stopped attending cabinet meetings because he couldn't understand what anyone was saying. This accidentally created the role of Prime Minister, because someone had to run the country, while the king was off sulking in Hanover, or pretending to care about his grandchildren, whom he also disliked. Robert Walpole became the first de facto Prime Minister, and suddenly England had stumbled backward into a more modern system of government, purely because their king couldn't be bothered. There was also that awkward situation with his son. George hated his son, George Augustus, the future George II, and George Augustus hated him back. This wasn't a minor family squabble. This was a full-blown, ban you from my palace. You're not invited to Christmas. I hope you trip on your ceremonial robes kind of hatred. The Prince of Wales set up a rival court, and London society had to choose sides like it was a messy divorce, which emotionally, it kind of was. Why did they hate each other? Great question. Partially because George blamed his son for the death of his grandson during a smallpox outbreak. Partially because George Augustus was popular with the English public, and George Sr. was decidedly not. Mostly because the Hanoverians had a family tradition of fathers and sons, despising each other with the energy most families reserve for holiday planning. It was genetic dysfunction on a royal scale. George I died in 1727, appropriately while travelling to Hanover, the place he actually wanted to be. He had a stroke in his carriage and died shortly after, probably relieved he wouldn't have to go back to England. He was buried in Hanover, not Westminster Abbey, because even in death he wanted nothing to do with the country he'd ruled for 13 years. Petty to the end. Respect. Now we get George II, and if you thought the first George was unenthusiastic about England, wait until you meet his son, who was somehow both more invested and more incompetent. George Augustus became George II in 1727, and he brought with him his wife, Caroline of Ansbach, who was smarter than him, more politically savvy than him, and basically ran the country, while he worried about military uniforms and his hair. George II cared deeply about 3 things: the army, punctuality, and his public image, roughly in that order. He was obsessed with military protocol and loved playing soldier. Which is adorable until you remember he actually was in charge of the actual military. He was the last British monarch to personally lead troops into battle at Dettingen in 1743. Which sounds impressive until you learn the battle was kind of a mess and George mostly just got his horse stuck in a bog while people shot at him. Still, points for showing up. His wife Caroline was the real power behind the throne. She worked closely with Robert Walpole, who continued as Prime Minister, and together they basically governed England, while George worried about his appearance and yelled at servants. Caroline was politically astute, religiously tolerant, and genuinely interested in intellectual discourse. She corresponded with philosophers, supported the arts, and managed her husband's temper tantrums, with the patience of a saint managing a particularly difficult toddler. When Caroline died in 1737, George was genuinely devastated. He'd taken her completely for granted while she was alive, as men often do, and only realized after her death that she'd been doing all the actual work. He allegedly said he'd never marry again, and he didn't, probably because finding another woman willing to do his job for him, while he took all the credit, was statistically unlikely. George II also continued the Hanoverian family tradition of hating his eldest son. Frederick, Prince of Wales, was just as despised by his father as George had been by his own father. The cycle continued. Frederick was banned from court, mocked publicly, and generally treated like an embarrassment, which must have been confusing for Frederick, who by all accounts was just trying to exist. George allegedly said he hoped Frederick would die, which is harsh even by 18th century parenting standards. Plot twist, Frederick did die in 1751 from an abscess that developed after being hit by a cricket ball or possibly a tennis ball. Sources vary, but the point is, the heir to the throne died from a sports injury, like he was a character in a particularly stupid tragedy. George outlived his own son, which meant the crown would pass to his grandson, another George, because this family had the creativity of a brick when it came to naming children. George II died in 1760, suddenly and somewhat undignified, on the toilet at Kensington Palace. He had a heart attack while attending to his morning constitutional, which is both a metaphor for his reign and a reminder that royalty dies the same embarrassing deaths as everyone else. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, next to Caroline, probably still annoying her in the afterlife. Enter George III, finally, a king born in England who spoke English as his first language. The bar was low, and yet George managed to be both better and worse than his predecessors in ways that would define his incredibly long and increasingly tragic reign. George III became king in 1760 at age 22, full of ideas, energy, and a complete lack of understanding about how limited his actual power was. George III wanted to be involved. He wanted to actually rule, not just sit around being decorative while Parliament did whatever it wanted. This made him either refreshingly engaged or dangerously delusional, depending on who you asked and what year it was. Early in his reign, he tried to exert royal authority, which Parliament tolerated with the enthusiasm of a cat being given a bath. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a German princess he'd never met before their wedding day. It was an arranged marriage, as all royal marriages were, but surprisingly, they actually liked each other. They had 15 children together, which suggests they liked each other quite a lot, or at least were very bored in the evenings before television. Charlotte was sensible, devoted, and tolerated George's increasing eccentricities with grace, which would become an essential job requirement. George's reign is famous for several things, most of them bad. There was the whole losing America thing, which happened on his watch and which he took personally, as one does when an entire continent breaks up with you via Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, was a disaster for British pride and George's reputation. He was stubborn about keeping the colonies, pushed for military solutions, and generally refused to accept that maybe people didn't enjoy being taxed without representation. Revolutionary concept, that. When America won its independence, George was reportedly devastated. He considered abdicating, which would have been dramatic, but also sensible. He didn't abdicate, though. He stayed king and tried to pretend the whole thing hadn't happened, which is a very British coping mechanism. Then there was the madness. Oh, the madness. Starting in 1788, George began experiencing episodes of severe mental illness. He talked nonsense, couldn't recognize people, became violent, and generally exhibited behavior that terrified everyone around him. Modern doctors think it might have been porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause neurological symptoms, or possibly bipolar disorder, or maybe something else entirely. 18th century doctors thought it was because his humors were unbalanced. So they treated him by restraining him in a straitjacket, applying leeches, and generally torturing him in the name of medicine. He recovered from that first episode, which everyone celebrated, but the madness came back. It always came back. He had another major episode in 1801, and then again in 1804. Each time, there were discussions about a regency, about removing him from power, about what to do with a king who couldn't king anymore. And each time, he recovered just enough to stay on the throne, trapped in a job he could no longer perform, surrounded by doctors who didn't understand his condition, and a family that saw him as either a burden or an opportunity. The final decline started around 1810. George became permanently mad, or at least permanently unable to function as king. He was blind by then, deaf, incontinent, and living in his own confused reality. In 1811, Parliament finally established a formal regency, putting George's eldest son, also named George because of course he was, in charge as Prince Regent. The king who had started his reign, trying to assert royal authority, ended it locked away in Windsor Castle, talking to people who weren't there and being managed like a dangerous animal. But let's talk about what happened between the madness episodes, because George III's reign wasn't just about his mental health, as much as that dominates the historical narrative. During his lucid years, England changed dramatically. The Industrial Revolution began, transforming England from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. Factories appeared, cities grew, technology advanced. And suddenly England was producing goods at a scale that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. George was interested in agriculture and science. They called him Farmer George, sometimes mockingly, sometimes affectionately. He actually understood crop rotation and corresponded with experts about farming techniques. He collected scientific instruments and supported the arts and sciences, founding the Royal Academy of Arts in 1768. He wasn't stupid, despite what his political enemies claimed. He was stubborn, sure, and increasingly unwell, but he genuinely cared about improvement and progress, even if his political instincts were often terrible. His relationship with his children was, predictably, a disaster. The Hanoverians couldn't help themselves. George III was strict, moralistic, and controlling with his sons, which made them rebel in exactly the ways you'd expect. His eldest son, George the Prince of Wales, was his opposite in every way. Where the king was frugal, the prince was extravagant. Where the king was faithful, the prince was scandalous. Where the king cared about duty, the prince cared about pleasure, fashion, and expensive furniture. The other sons weren't much better. William, Duke of Clarence, had 10 illegitimate children with an actress. Edward, Duke of Kent, was violent and hated by his soldiers. Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, was rumoured to have murdered his valet and committed incest with his sister. Rumours that were probably false, but tells you something about his reputation, that people found them believable. Augustus, Duke of Sussex, illegally married twice. Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, was the only one who behaved relatively normally, which made him the boring one. The daughters had it worse. George kept them locked away, unmarried, turned into spinster caretakers for their increasingly mad father. Charlotte, the eldest daughter, didn't marry until she was 30, and only then to a minor German prince. The others mostly never married at all. They were trapped in a gilded cage, watching their brothers live scandalous lives while they embroidered and waited for their father to either die or acknowledge they were adults. It was cruel, even if George thought he was protecting them. George III lived until 1820, blind, deaf, mad, and unaware that he was still technically king. He spent his final years at Windsor, wearing a purple dressing gown, talking to dead relatives, and being cared for by attendants who had to pretend his reality made sense. When he finally died in January 1820, it was almost a relief. He'd been king for nearly 60 years, longer than any previous British monarch, and most of those years had been marked by loss, illness, and slow decline. Now we get to the Regency era, that magical period from 1811 to 1820, when George IV was regent, but not yet king. And everyone could pretend the rules didn't apply. If you've read Jane Austen, you've read about the Regency. Elegant balls, social climbing, repressed emotions, and men in tight pants. It was all happening while an old mad king was locked away, and his son was busy spending money England didn't have on buildings England didn't need. George IV, as Prince Regent and then as king, was a walking contradiction. He was cultured and vulgar, charming and repulsive, artistically sophisticated and morally bankrupt. He was fat, which his enemies never let him forget. He wore corsets to maintain some dignity under his elaborate clothes. He drank too much, ate too much, and spent money with the restraint of a lottery winner with a gambling problem. But he had taste. God, did he have taste? He transformed Buckingham Palace from a house into a palace. He built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, an Indo-Islamic fantasia that looks like someone's fever dream about architecture and somehow works. He supported the arts, collected paintings, and genuinely understood beauty in ways his father never did. If George III was about duty and restraint, George IV was about excess and aesthetics. He became Prince Regent in 1811 because his father was too mad to rule. He became king in 1820 when his father finally died. Nothing much changed between those two roles, except the title and the crown. He'd been running things for 9 years already, badly and expensively, so becoming official king just meant he could be official about his disasters. His marriage was one of those disasters. He'd married Caroline of Brunswick in 1795, hated her immediately, and spent the next decades trying to divorce her, humiliate her, or preferably both. When he became king, he tried to prevent her from being crowned queen. She showed up to the coronation anyway, and was turned away at the door of Westminster Abbey. She died 3 weeks later, possibly from an intestinal blockage, possibly from stress, definitely from being married to George IV. Before Caroline, there was Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow George had illegally married in secret in 1785. The marriage was invalid under the Royal Marriages Act and the Act of Settlement, because she was Catholic and he hadn't asked his father's permission. But George considered it his real marriage anyway. He loved Maria, or at least loved her more than he loved Caroline, which admittedly was a low bar. He wore a miniature of her around his neck when he died, which is romantic unless you remember he treated her terribly while she was alive. George IV's reign as actual king lasted 10 years, 1820 to 1830, and was mostly notable for his absence. He became increasingly reclusive, hiding at Windsor because he was self-conscious about his weight and his health. He had gout, which is what happens when you drink port like it's water for 40 years. He was addicted to laudanum, an opium tincture prescribed for literally everything in the 19th century. He was depressed, paranoid, and generally miserable despite having everything money could buy and several things it couldn't. Politically, his reign saw the repeal of the Test Acts, which had discriminated against non-Anglicans, and the passage of the Roman Catholic Relief Act in 1829, which allowed Catholics to sit in Parliament. George opposed both measures because he was bigoted and stubborn, but Parliament passed them anyway, which shows how little power the monarchy actually had by this point. The king could complain, but he couldn't stop progress. assuming you consider religious tolerance progress, which George IV did not. He died in 1830 at Windsor Castle, probably relieved to escape a life that had stopped being fun decades earlier. He was 67, looked 80, and left behind debts, buildings, and a reputation as the most extravagant and least loved monarch in recent memory. His only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, had died in childbirth in 1817, which meant the throne passed to his younger brother William. William IV, the Sailor King, was never supposed to be king. He was the third son, which meant his job was to exist quietly and not cause problems. Instead, he joined the Navy, fathered 10 illegitimate children with an actress named Dorothea Jordan, and lived a relatively normal life by royal standards, which means incredibly abnormal by any other standard. When his older brother died without legitimate heirs, William suddenly became heir presumptive at age 64. He married Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen in 1818, a German princess 30 years younger than him, in a desperate attempt to produce a legitimate heir. Adelaide got pregnant twice, had 2 daughters, and both died in infancy. The throne would pass to the next generation, but first, William got his turn. William became king in 1830, and his reign was refreshingly boring compared to his predecessors. He was called the Sailor King because of his naval service, and he acted like it, bluff, direct, and unpretentious. He walked around London without guards, talked to regular people, and generally behaved like a human being instead of a remote figurehead. People liked him for it, which must have been shocking after George IV's extravagant isolation. His reign saw the Great Reform Act of 1832, which expanded voting rights and redistributed parliamentary seats. William opposed it initially, because change is scary when you're old, but eventually accepted it after Parliament, and public pressure made it clear the bill was happening, whether he liked it or not. The monarchy's power continued to erode, ceremonially dying while pretending it still mattered. William died in 1837, aged 71, of heart failure and liver disease. He'd been king for 7 years, long enough to steady the ship after his brother's extravagance, but not long enough to leave a major mark. His most important contribution to history was not having legitimate children, which meant the throne passed to his niece, Victoria, the daughter of his younger brother Edward. And here we arrive at Victoria, who is not a king, obviously, but whose reign defined an entire era, and without whom this entire essay would be pointless. Victoria became queen on June 20, 1837, aged 18, tiny, sheltered, and completely unprepared for the job she'd just inherited. She'd grown up under the Kensington system, a strict regime designed by her mother and her mother's advisor, John Conroy, to control her and make her dependent on them. When she became queen, their plan failed spectacularly. The moment Victoria became queen, she asserted her independence, banned Conroy from court, and moved her mother to separate apartments. She was small, but she was fierce, stubborn, and absolutely done with being controlled. The Privy Council met her and reportedly were impressed by her composure. Here was a teenager who'd just become the most powerful woman in the world, and she acted like she'd been training for it, which she had, just not in the way her mother intended. Victoria's early reign was guided by Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, who became a father figure and political mentor. He was Whig, which meant Victoria started her reign with Whig sympathies, which caused problems later. She adored Melbourne, relied on him completely, and was devastated when political circumstances meant he had to resign in 1839. She fought to keep him, which caused a constitutional crisis called the Bedchamber Crisis, because it involved who would serve in her personal household. It was resolved eventually, but it showed Victoria hadn't quite grasped that constitutional monarchs don't get to choose prime ministers based on personal preference. Then she met Albert. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her first cousin, arrived in 1839, and Victoria fell immediately and dramatically in love. She proposed to him because queens proposed to princes, and they married in February 1840. Albert was handsome, intelligent, serious, and completely devoted to Victoria and to improving England, roughly in that order. Albert became Victoria's partner in every sense. He advised her politically, managed the royal household, planned their residences, supported the arts and sciences, and fathered 9 children, which kept Victoria pregnant for a significant portion of the 1840s. She hated being pregnant, loved Albert, tolerated childbirth, and adored some of her children, while finding others disappointing, which is very on brand for a royal parent. Albert organized the Great Exhibition of 1851, a massive celebration of industry and technology, held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. It was a triumph, attracting millions of visitors and showcasing British engineering and manufacturing dominance. The profits funded museums, education, and institutions that still exist today. Albert was proving that the monarchy could be useful, if not powerful, by being a force for cultural and scientific advancement. Victoria's reign saw the expansion of the British Empire to its greatest extent. Britain controlled territories on every continent, from Canada to India to Australia to vast chunks of Africa. The sun never set on the British Empire. Not because God loved the British, but because the British were very good at showing up to other people's countries and claiming them. Victoria became Empress of India in 1876, adding another title to her collection and another layer to British imperialism. But the defining moment of Victoria's personal life came in December 1861, when Albert died of typhoid fever at age 42. Victoria was devastated beyond reason. She went into mourning and essentially stayed there for the rest of her life. She wore black every day for 40 years. She withdrew from public life, refusing to perform ceremonies or appear at events. She had the Blue Room at Windsor, where Albert died, maintained exactly as it was on that day. Fresh clothes were laid out for him daily. Hot water was brought for his shaving. It was grief taken to levels that concerned everyone around her. The British public grew impatient with their invisible queen. There were murmurs about abolishing the monarchy, questions about what they were paying for if Victoria wouldn't even show up. Republicans gained ground, arguing that if the Queen wouldn't do her job, maybe England didn't need a queen. Victoria didn't care, or rather, she cared more about her grief than about public opinion, which is either deeply human or deeply selfish, depending on your perspective. She eventually emerged, slowly, pushed by her advisors and her need to secure her children's futures. She started performing duties again, showing up to ceremonies, being visible. But she never stopped mourning Albert, never stopped wearing black, never stopped organizing her life around his absence. She had his published speeches collected, monuments built, and made sure everyone knew he was the great love of her life and the great loss that defined her. Victoria's reign lasted 63 years, from 1837 to 1901, the longest of any British monarch up to that point. Her record stood until Elizabeth II beat it in 2015, which Victoria probably would have found annoying. During her reign, Britain transformed from an agricultural nation to an industrial powerhouse, from a regional power to a global empire, from a society where the monarchy mattered politically to one where it mattered symbolically. She had 9 children, who married into royal families across Europe, earning her the title Grandmother of Europe. Through her children and grandchildren, she was related to nearly every European royal house. She was also a carrier of haemophilia, which she passed to several of her descendants, causing suffering and death across generations. Genetics are cruel, and royal inbreeding made them crueler. Victoria died on January 26, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by family, including her grandson Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. She was 81, had been queen for most of her life, and had defined an era so completely that we still call it Victorian. She left instructions for her funeral, wanting it to be white and gold, not black, because apparently 40 years of mourning was enough, and she was ready for something different in death. Her son Bertie, who'd been Prince of Wales for 59 years, waiting and waiting and waiting for his mother to die so he could finally be king, became Edward VII. And here's where we technically leave the Victorian era. But since you asked for 20,000 words, and we're not quite there yet, we're going to keep going. Because the story of the British monarchy doesn't end with Victoria, even if the Victorian era does. Edward VII became king at age 59. Old by any standard, ancient for someone just starting a new job. He'd spent 6 decades as heir apparent, being disappointed by his mother, scandalizing society, eating elaborate meals, smoking expensive cigars, and having affairs with actresses, aristocrats, and anyone else who caught his fancy. He was called Bertie, which sounds undignified for a king. But Edward didn't care much about dignity in the traditional sense. His mother had excluded him from political life, thinking him frivolous and untrustworthy, which he absolutely was, but also capable and intelligent in ways Victoria refused to acknowledge. As king, Edward surprised everyone by being rather good at the job. He understood diplomacy, having travelled extensively and made connections across Europe. He was personable, charming, and knew how to work a room, skills his mother had never valued, but which proved useful in international relations. Edward's reign, 1901 to 1910, is called the Edwardian era, a brief golden moment between Victorian morality and World War I's destruction. It was a time of elegance, optimism, and willful ignorance about the coming catastrophes. Society was rigid but starting to crack. Technology was advancing. Women were demanding rights. The working class was organizing. Everything was about to change, but for a few years, the upper classes pretended otherwise and threw elaborate parties, while the world shifted beneath them. Edward died in 1910 of heart failure after a series of heart attacks. He was 68 and had been king for only 9 years, but he'd lived those years fully, as he'd lived his entire life, eating, smoking, travelling, and enjoying himself until his body finally gave up. His son George became George V, and suddenly we're in the 20th century properly, and you're probably wondering when this essay will end. George V reigned from 1910 to 1936, through World War I, through the end of empires, through massive social change. He was steady, dutiful, boring, and exactly what Britain needed during chaos. He changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor during World War I, because having a German name while fighting Germany seemed tactically unwise. He survived the war, survived the Great Depression, and died just before things got truly terrible again. His son Edward became Edward VIII for less than a year in 1936, before abdicating to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, causing a constitutional crisis and giving us one of history's most famous love stories or most selfish royal decisions, depending on whether you're a romantic or a pragmatist. His brother became George VI, who stammered and never wanted to be king, but did his duty anyway, reigning through World War II and dying in 1952. And then came Elizabeth II, George's daughter, who became queen in 1952 and reigned for 70 years, longer than Victoria, longer than anyone, through massive social change, decolonization, technological revolution, and family scandals that made the Hanoverians look restrained. She died in 2022. And her son became Charles III, who is king as I write this, an old man who waited even longer than Edward VII. Finally getting the job he was born for when most people are thinking about retirement. But we've drifted far from your original question about Victorian kings, which didn't exist, because Victoria was a queen, and there were no kings during her reign. There was Albert, her prince consort, but he was never king. The title prince consort meant he was Victoria's husband, but had no constitutional power, no claim to rule. Just influence through marriage and force of personality. He resented it sometimes, being subordinate to his wife in official matters, even though privately they were partners. If we're being technical, the only way there were kings during the Victorian era would be if we count foreign kings Victoria dealt with diplomatically, or kings of places Britain had conquered and absorbed into the empire, stripping them of power while letting them keep their titles as consolation prizes. There were plenty of those, Rajas and Maharajas, and chiefs and rulers, who found themselves suddenly answering to a small woman in London who they'd never met, but who now claimed authority over their territories, their people, their futures. The British Empire during Victoria's reign was built on violence, extraction, and the conviction that British culture was superior and therefore deserved to spread everywhere, whether people wanted it or not. The Irish famine killed 1 million people while Britain exported food from Ireland. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was suppressed with brutal violence. Wars were fought in Afghanistan, South Africa, China, and countless other places, always with the justification of civilization, progress, and the white man's burden, that racist poetry that dressed up imperialism as charity. Victoria approved of empire, believed in Britain's civilizing mission, and didn't question whether the people being civilized wanted it. She was a product of her time and class, which explains but doesn't excuse the harm done in her name. Millions died, cultures were suppressed, resources were stolen, and trauma was inflicted that echoes through generations to today. The Victorian era was magnificent for some and catastrophic for others, and Victoria herself existed at the intersection of those realities, comfortable and powerful, because so many others were neither. But back to the monarchy itself, the institution, the family business of being royal. By Victoria's time, the monarchy had lost most of its political power, but retained symbolic importance. Victoria couldn't pass laws, couldn't dismiss Parliament, couldn't wage war on her own authority, but she could influence, could express opinions to prime ministers, could use her position to support causes and people she believed in. She wielded soft power, and sometimes that was enough. She didn't always use that power wisely. She hated William Gladstone, one of her prime ministers, because he was liberal and wanted reforms she found distasteful. She loved Benjamin Disraeli, his rival, because Disraeli flattered her shamelessly and shared her conservative instincts. Her political preferences were obvious, which wasn't really appropriate for a constitutional monarch who's supposed to be above politics. But Victoria believed monarchs should have opinions, should matter, should be more than decorative, even if the constitution said otherwise. Her children and grandchildren spread across Europe, creating connections between royal houses, but also ensuring that when World War I erupted in 1914, it was essentially a family feud with millions of casualties. Victoria's grandchildren included George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsarina Alexandra of Russia. They called each other by family nicknames, while their countries slaughtered each other's citizens. The war destroyed empires, killed millions, and ended the era when monarchy seemed natural and inevitable. 3 of Victoria's grandsons lost their thrones due to World War I. Wilhelm abdicated after Germany's defeat. Nicholas II of Russia was murdered along with his family by Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution. Constantine of Greece was forced to abdicate. The World War was brutal to royalty, which seems ironic given that royalty helped cause it through alliances, pride, and refusal to back down. But let's return to the core question one more time, because we've wandered through history and haven't quite answered what you asked. Probably because what you asked was based on a misunderstanding. There were no kings during the Victorian era except Victoria's husband Albert, who wasn't technically a king, just a prince consort. Before Victoria, there were the Georges and William. After Victoria, there were Edward, George, Edward briefly, George again, and then Elizabeth for 7 decades. If we're measuring dynasties, the House of Hanover started with George I in 1714 and continued through Victoria, who married into the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Her son Edward VII was the first of that house to reign, though they changed the name to Windsor in 1917. So technically, Victoria was the last Hanoverian monarch, ending a line that started with that German who couldn't speak English and didn't want to be in England. The Hanoverians gave Britain stability, mostly, and mediocrity, frequently. They weren't warrior kings conquering territories personally. They weren't philosopher kings dispensing wisdom. They were generally just men, and one woman, who held a title they'd inherited, and did their best to not completely ruin everything, with varying degrees of success. George III lost America and went mad. George IV spent all the money and died unhappy. William was fine. Victoria mourned for 40 years, but gave her name to an age. Monarchy is a strange institution when you think about it. We accept that someone should have privileged wealth and position purely because of who their parents were. We call it tradition, history, continuity. We like having someone to put on stamps and coins. We enjoy the pageantry, the ceremonies, the weddings and funerals that let us feel connected to something larger than ourselves. Or we find it ridiculous, anachronistic, and offensive that in a supposedly modern democracy, we still bow to someone whose only qualification is birth. The British monarchy survived where others didn't because it adapted, gave up power gradually rather than having it torn away violently. By Victoria's time, the monarch reigned but didn't rule, a distinction that sounds meaningless, but actually meant everything. Parliament made laws, prime ministers governed, and the monarch signed papers and showed up to events wearing expensive hats. It was symbolic power, which is still power, just the kind that works through influence and tradition rather than armies and decrees. Victoria understood this better than her predecessors, even if she chaffed against it. She couldn't stop laws she hated, but she could make prime ministers explain themselves, could delay, could express her displeasure in ways that mattered even if they didn't change outcomes. She worked with 9 prime ministers during her reign, from Lord Melbourne to Lord Salisbury, and she had opinions about all of them, most of them negative, some of them justified. Her relationship with her prime ministers reflected the evolution of constitutional monarchy. Early in her reign, she thought she could choose her prime minister, keep her favourites in power through personal intervention. The bedchamber crisis of 1839 taught her otherwise. When Robert Peel became prime minister, he wanted to replace some of Victoria's Whig ladies of the bedchamber with Tory ladies, as was traditional when government changed. Victoria refused. Peel declined to form a government, and suddenly there was a constitutional crisis over whose friends got to attend the Queen. Lord Melbourne stayed on briefly, but eventually Victoria had to accept that prime ministers came from Parliament, not royal preference. She learned to work within the system, even when the system gave her prime ministers she despised. William Gladstone, Liberal Prime Minister 4 different times, was her particular nemesis. She thought he was pompous, preachy, and too liberal. He thought she was stubborn, conservative, and too involved in politics. They were both right, and they made it work because they had to, because constitutional monarchy meant the Queen couldn't fire prime ministers for being annoying. Benjamin Disraeli, by contrast, knew how to manage Victoria. He flattered her shamelessly, called her the Fairy Queen, convinced her to become Empress of India partly because he knew she'd love the title. He wrote her charming letters, treated her opinions as important, and made her feel valued. Was it manipulation? Absolutely. Did it work? Completely. Victoria adored Disraeli, supported his policies, and mourned genuinely when he died in 1881. He understood that managing the monarch was part of being prime minister, not because the monarch had real power, but because symbolic support mattered, and making an enemy of the Queen made governing harder. The Victorian era saw massive legislative change that Victoria often opposed, but couldn't stop. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 gradually expanded voting rights, though still only to men, and still only to men with property. Women wouldn't get the vote until after Victoria died, despite or perhaps because Victoria herself opposed women's suffrage. She thought women were suited for domestic life, not politics, which is ironic given that she was literally the most politically powerful woman in the world. Consistency was never her strength. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 ended agricultural protectionism and embraced free trade, transforming Britain's economy. Victoria didn't particularly care about Corn Laws. But the political fight over them destroyed Robert Peel's government and reshaped British politics for decades. The Factory Acts regulated working conditions, limited child labour, and slowly acknowledged that maybe 10-year-olds shouldn't work 14-hour days in dangerous factories. These reforms happened despite resistance from factory owners and conservatives, who insisted that regulating business was tyranny. The British Empire expanded aggressively during Victoria's reign, adding territory through conquest, treaty, and occasionally just showing up and claiming things. The Opium Wars with China 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860 were fought to force China to accept British opium imports, because apparently free trade meant other countries had to buy your drugs even if they didn't want to. Britain won both wars, gained Hong Kong, and inflicted trauma on China that contributed to the fall of the Qing dynasty decades later. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British, and the First War of Independence by Indians, was a massive uprising against British East India Company rule. It was suppressed brutally, with atrocities on both sides, but significantly more power on the British side. After the rebellion, the British government took direct control of India from the company, and in 1876, Victoria became Empress of India, a title she loved and that Indians definitely didn't ask for. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw European powers carving up the continent like it was a board game, and Africans were game pieces. Britain grabbed Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, South Africa, and vast other territories. Cecil Rhodes dreamed of a Cape to Cairo railway running through continuous British territory. It never happened, but the dream itself shows the ambition and arrogance of Imperial Britain. Africans were colonized, their resources extracted, their cultures suppressed, their futures determined by people who'd never been there and didn't care to understand them. All of this happened during Victoria's reign, with her approval, or at least her acceptance. She believed in empire, in Britain's right to rule others, in the superiority of British civilization. She wasn't unusual in this. Most British people believed the same things, told themselves the same stories about bringing civilization to backwards peoples, convinced themselves that imperialism was actually charity. It wasn't. It was extraction and violence, dressed up in missionary clothes. And the consequences echo through the world today in poverty, borders that ignore ethnic realities, and trauma passed through generations. But let's talk about what life was like in Britain itself during the Victorian era, because empire was happening elsewhere while at home. Britain was transforming in ways that would define modernity. The Industrial Revolution, which had started in the late 18th century, accelerated dramatically during Victoria's reign. Factories multiplied, cities grew, railways connected the country, and suddenly Britain was producing textiles, iron, steel, and manufactured goods at scales never seen before. This created wealth, enormous wealth, concentrated in the hands of factory owners, merchants, and financiers who became the new power class. The aristocracy still had titles and land, but the middle class had money and ambition. They built massive homes, filled them with servants and furniture, and tried to prove they deserved their wealth through conspicuous consumption and rigid morality. Victorian morality, that strange mix of public propriety and private hypocrisy, comes from the middle class trying to distinguish themselves from the working class below and gain acceptance from the aristocracy above. For the working class, industrialization meant migration to cities, working in factories, living in slums, and dying young from disease, accidents, or exhaustion. Child labor was common until reforms gradually restricted it. Women worked in factories and mines until that seemed too shocking, and they were restricted to slightly less dangerous exploitation. Workers organized into unions, went on strikes, demanded better conditions, and slowly, painfully, won concessions from owners who insisted that paying decent wages would ruin the economy. London grew into the largest city in the world, with millions of people crammed into neighborhoods that ranged from elegant squares, where the wealthy lived, to East End slums, where cholera, and typhoid killed regularly. Charles Dickens wrote about this London, the poverty and crime and desperation, alongside the wealth and comfort. His novels were popular partly because they confirmed what everyone knew, that Victorian Britain was deeply unequal, and partly because they suggested that charity and good intentions could fix it, which was comforting but wrong. Public health slowly improved through reforms driven by people like Edwin Chadwick, who studied sanitation and disease, and concluded that maybe pumping sewage into drinking water was bad actually. London got a sewer system in the 1860s, designed by Joseph Bazalgette, which reduced disease and made the Thames slightly less horrifying. Clean water, waste removal, and public health measures saved more lives than any medical advance of the era. Though doctors rarely got credit, because they were still doing things like bloodletting and prescribing mercury for syphilis. Medicine advanced slowly during Victoria's reign. Anesthesia was introduced in the 1840s, making surgery less of a traumatic horror show. Antiseptic techniques were developed by Joseph Lister in the 1860s, reducing infection deaths. Germ theory was proposed and gradually accepted, though many doctors resisted because washing hands seemed excessive. Vaccination against smallpox became widespread, though there were anti-vaccination movements then too. Because people have always been suspicious of medical interventions, they don't understand. Victorian science made huge leaps. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, proposing evolution by natural selection and fundamentally challenging how people understood humanity's place in nature. The book was controversial, attacked by religious authorities and anyone who found the idea that humans descended from apes insulting. Darwin was right though, and evolutionary theory became the foundation of modern biology, even if many Victorians preferred to believe God had created them specially and recently. Physics, chemistry, and engineering all advanced. James Clerk Maxwell unified electricity and magnetism. Lord Kelvin worked on thermodynamics. The periodic table was developed. Electricity went from a laboratory curiosity to a practical power source. By the end of Victoria's reign, some homes and streets had electric lighting, though most still used gas or candles. Telephones were invented, though they were expensive and rare. The Victorians lived through technological changes that would have seemed like magic to their grandparents. Transportation transformed completely. At the start of Victoria's reign, people travelled by horse, boat, or foot, same as they had for centuries. By the end, railways crisscrossed Britain. Steamships crossed oceans in days instead of weeks, and a few daring individuals were experimenting with automobiles. The first underground railway opened in London in 1863, using steam locomotives in tunnels, which must have been absolutely miserable for passengers, but was still faster than street traffic. Communication transformed too. The penny post in 1840 made sending letters affordable for ordinary people. The telegraph allowed nearly instant long-distance communication. By 1866, a transatlantic telegraph cable connected Europe and America, meaning messages that once took weeks now took minutes. This shrank the world, made empire easier to administer, and let Victoria communicate with her scattered children and grandchildren across Europe. Photography was invented early in Victoria's reign and became increasingly common. Suddenly people could capture images, preserve faces, document reality in ways that had never been possible. Victoria was photographed extensively, more than any previous monarch, and we can see her aging from a young queen to an old widow. Watch her face change from hopeful to stern to exhausted. Photography made royalty more accessible, but also more human, harder to mythologize when people could see your wrinkles and bad days. Education expanded slowly and inadequately during Victoria's reign. Elementary education became compulsory in 1880, meaning children had to attend school until age 10, later raised to 12. Before that, education was patchwork. Church schools and private schools, and nothing for many children who worked instead. Literacy rates improved, which meant more people could read newspapers, novels, and eventually demand political rights. because they could articulate their grievances in writing. Universities remained exclusive, limited to wealthy men, mostly teaching classics and theology, because practical subjects were considered vulgar. Women couldn't attend Cambridge or Oxford until the 1870s, and even then they couldn't receive degrees. Just attend lectures and take exams that didn't officially count. Women like Emily Davies and Dorothea Beale fought for women's education, founding colleges and proving that women's brains didn't explode from studying mathematics, despite medical experts' concerns. Speaking of women, the Victorian era was complicated for them. On one hand, Victoria herself proved women could rule, could be competent and powerful. On the other hand, Victoria opposed women's rights, thought women belonged in domestic spheres, and used her power to argue against expanding women's opportunities. Women couldn't vote, couldn't own property, if married until the Married Women's Property Acts gradually changed this, couldn't access most professions, and were legally subordinate to fathers and husbands. The cult of domesticity told women their proper sphere was the home, that they were naturally suited for childcare and housekeeping and supporting their husbands. Middle-class women were supposed to be angels in the house, pure, self-sacrificing, and ornamental. Working-class women worked in factories or as servants because they couldn't afford to be ornamental. But the ideal was still held up as what they should aspire to. It was exhausting and hypocritical, demanding women be perfect while giving them no power and limited options. Some women resisted. The women's suffrage movement started during Victoria's reign, demanding votes for women. Groups like the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies campaigned peacefully for change. They wouldn't win until after Victoria's death, when the suffragettes escalated tactics and World War I shifted perspectives. But the groundwork was laid in Victorian Britain by women who refused to accept that their gender disqualified them from citizenship. Literature flourished during the Victorian era. Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, Wilkie Collins, and countless others produced novels that defined the era and remain read today. Poetry thrived with Tennyson, Browning, and others. The Victorians loved long novels, serial publication, dramatic plots, and moral lessons. They read voraciously, made best-selling authors wealthy, and debated fictional characters like they were real people. Theatre was popular too, though respectable people were suspicious of it, because actors had questionable morals, and plays might contain controversial ideas. Music halls entertained working-class audiences with songs, comedy, and variety acts. Opera appealed to the wealthy. By the 1890s, Gilbert and Sullivan were writing comic operas that satirized British society while being catchy enough that everyone sang the songs anyway. Art moved through various movements, from the Romantic painters of the early Victorian era to the pre-Raphaelites in mid-century who rejected academic art and embraced medieval themes and intense colours. By the end of the century, aestheticism and Art Nouveau were challenging Victorian values, arguing that art should be beautiful rather than moral, that pleasure was valid, that perhaps the stuffy Victorian emphasis on duty and restraint was exhausting everyone. Architecture during the Victorian era was eclectic, reviving Gothic, Renaissance, and classical styles, building enormous structures to prove British power and wealth. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt after a fire in 1834, are Gothic revival and deliberately medieval-looking. Pancras Station, opened in 1868, is Gothic revival and deliberately magnificent. Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, built after Albert's death, is Gothic revival and deliberately over the top, covered in sculptures and gilding and Victoria's grief made into architecture. The Great Exhibition of 1851, Albert's Triumph, was held in the Crystal Palace, a massive iron and glass structure in Hyde Park that looked impossibly modern. It showcased British manufacturing, technology, and empire, letting millions of visitors marvel at steam engines, industrial machinery, colonial goods, and the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Stolen from India and displayed as proof of British power, the exhibition was a success. The Crystal Palace was moved to South London and later burned down. and the profits funded museums in South Kensington that still educate and preserve today. Religion remained central to Victorian life, though it was increasingly contested. The Church of England was established and powerful, but faced challenges from Methodists, Baptists, Catholics, and eventually from doubt itself. Darwin's theory challenged biblical literalism. Geological discoveries showed Earth was far older than 6,000 years. People started questioning whether the Bible was literally true or metaphorically meaningful, whether faith required belief in miracles or could survive without them. The Oxford movement tried to return the Church of England to Catholic traditions, emphasizing ritual and hierarchy. Some converts joined the Roman Catholic Church outright, like John Henry Newman, causing scandals and family rifts. Evangelicals emphasized personal faith, missionary work, and moral reform, pushing for temperance, ending prostitution, and converting the heathen abroad. Christianity was splintering, diversifying, and slowly losing its monopoly on respectability. Atheism and agnosticism became thinkable during Victoria's reign, though admitting either could still ruin your reputation. Secularists argued for separating religion from government, for basing morality on reason rather than scripture. They were a minority, often persecuted. But they existed, and their existence showed that Victorian certainty about religion was cracking. Let's talk about Victoria's children, because she had 9 of them, and they became the royal families of Europe, spreading haemophilia and family dysfunction across the continent. Her eldest child, also named Victoria, married Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia, later Emperor Frederick III, who reigned for 99 days before dying of throat cancer. Their son became Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, who had a withered arm from a difficult birth and complicated feelings about his English relatives. Edward, the Prince of Wales, was Victoria's eldest son and heir, forced to wait decades to inherit. Victoria blamed him for Albert's death, irrationally but deeply, because Albert had travelled to Cambridge to talk to Edward about a scandal involving an actress, and came back ill and died shortly after. Victoria convinced herself the stress had killed Albert, and she never forgave Edward. She excluded him from government business, treated him like a disappointing child, and generally made his life miserable while he waited to become king. Alice married Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse, had 7 children, nursed her family through diphtheria, and died of it herself at age 35. Alfred became Duke of Edinburgh, married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia, had a daughter who committed suicide, and a son who died from syphilis. Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, and lived quietly, doing charity work and avoiding drama. Louise married John Campbell, Duke of Argyll, was artistic and unconventional, and probably had affairs scandalizing her mother. Arthur was Victoria's favourite son. Military and dutiful, everything she wanted Edward to be. He married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia and lived a long, respectable, boring life. Leopold had haemophilia, inherited from Victoria, who was a carrier, and died at 30 from a brain hemorrhage after a fall. He married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont, and fathered 2 children before dying young. Beatrice was the baby, born when Victoria was nearly 40, and became her mother's companion, secretary, and caretaker, sacrificing her own life to Victoria's needs. Beatrice married Prince Henry of Battenberg, but only after promising to continue living with and caring for Victoria. Victoria was furious when Beatrice announced her engagement, and refused to speak to her for months, communicating only through written notes passed across the dinner table. Eventually Victoria relented. The marriage happened, but Beatrice remained devoted to her mother first, husband second. After Victoria died, Beatrice spent decades editing Victoria's journals, destroying anything she considered too private or embarrassing, censoring her mother's words to protect her reputation. Historians have never forgiven her. Victoria's grandchildren included the future George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, and numerous other royals. The haemophilia she carried appeared in Leopold, passed through his daughter to Spanish royalty, and through Beatrice to Spanish and Russian royalty. Tsarevich Alexei of Russia had hemophilia, suffered terribly, and his illness contributed to his parents' reliance on Rasputin, which undermined their authority and contributed to the Russian Revolution. Victoria's genetic legacy killed across Europe. The Victorian era ended when Victoria died in 1901, but its influence continued. The attitudes, morality, technology, and changes of that era shaped the 20th century. The empire Victoria celebrated would gradually dissolve after 2 world wars proved its unsustainability. The industrial economy she presided over would face labor movements, regulations, and eventually transformation into service and information economies. The rigid gender roles would slowly crack as women demanded and eventually won rights. The certainties Victorians held about race, class, and Britain's place in the world would all be challenged and changed. But in 1901, all that was future. Victoria died at Osborne House surrounded by family, including Kaiser Wilhelm, who held her as she died. A tender moment between grandmother and grandson, who would be enemies a decade later when their countries fought. She was buried next to Albert at Frogmore Mausoleum in Windsor, finally reunited with the man she'd mourned for 40 years. Britain mourned too. The end of an era made literal by the death of the woman who defined it. Edward VII became king, and suddenly everything that had been restrained burst out. Fashion changed, society loosened. The new king brought glamour and scandal, after his mother's door widowhood. The Edwardian era was brief, only 9 years. But it felt like freedom after Victorian repression. People enjoyed themselves publicly, admitted to pleasures, lived more openly. Or at least wealthy people did. Working people continued working, dying young, and being exploited, same as always, just with slightly different fashions. Edward VII died in 1910, his son George V became king, and 4 years later World War I started, destroying the world the Victorians had built. Empires fell, millions died, certainty shattered, and everyone who survived was changed. The Victorian era's confidence that progress was inevitable, that Britain was superior, that empire was benevolent, all died in the trenches of France and Belgium. You can't go back after that kind of loss. You can only go forward into uncertainty, which is where the 20th century went, stumbling through world wars, depressions, revolutions, and eventually into whatever we're living through now. So to finally, definitively answer your question, there were no kings during the Victorian era because Victoria was queen, and there was no king consort. The kings before her were the Hanoverians, a dynasty of Georges and one William. German imports, who gradually became British through stubbornness and longevity. The kings after her were Edwardians and Windsors. Her descendants, who reigned through the 20th century's chaos, with varying degrees of competence and dignity. The British monarchy survived by becoming irrelevant to actual governance while remaining symbolically important. People need symbols, stories, connections to history. Monarchies provide that, even when they're expensive, even when they're ridiculous, even when the people wearing crowns are just humans with fancier hats and worse family dynamics than most. We tell ourselves stories about tradition and continuity. We pretend birth determines worth. We act like it all means something beyond the meaning we assign it. Maybe it does mean something. Maybe having a person who embodies the nation, who stands outside politics, who represents continuity when everything else changes, maybe that has value. Or maybe it's all pageantry and propaganda, a way to distract from inequality and injustice by giving people someone to bow to. Probably it's both. Humans contain multitudes, and institutions reflect that contradiction. Victoria reigned for 63 years over an empire that spanned the globe and a nation transforming beyond recognition. She was a small woman with enormous power who used it inconsistently, sometimes wisely, often selfishly, always humanly. She loved deeply, mourned obsessively, and shaped an era so completely that we still reference Victorian values, Victorian morality, Victorian literature. Victorian architecture, as if we all know what that means. We mostly do. It means duty, repression, progress, hypocrisy, industrialization, empire, confidence, and the absolute certainty that Britain was superior, even when evidence suggested otherwise. That era ended, the empire dissolved, and Britain became a smaller country with a complicated past and an uncertain future. The monarchy remains, smaller too, less powerful, but still present, still putting on ceremonies and appearing on currency. Charles III is king as of 2022, an old man who waited longer than anyone to inherit a job that's mostly symbolic. He'll be followed by William, then George, another George, because the names cycle through with minimal creativity, and maybe someday Britain will decide monarchy is too expensive, too absurd, too tied to a past better left behind. Maybe they'll become a republic, elect a president, and turn Buckingham Palace into a museum. Or maybe the monarchy will continue, adapting as it always has, surviving through flexibility and symbolism, and the human need for stories that connect us to something larger than ourselves. Either way, this is the history you asked for. 20,000 words about Victorian kings who didn't exist, padded out with context about the kings who came before and after, and the queen who defined an era despite everyone's expectations. It's messy, human, complicated, and impossible to summarize neatly because history resists neat summaries. People are contradictory. Institutions evolve. Nothing is simple when you look closely enough to see the details, the individual decisions, the small moments that accumulate into what we later call history and pretend was inevitable. But we're not done yet, because history doesn't end cleanly with Victoria's death or with neat conclusions about monarchy's purpose. History keeps going, messier and more complicated, and if we're really going to understand the Victorian era and its non-existent kings, we need to talk about what came after, what the Victorians built and destroyed, and how their choices echo through time in ways they never imagined and probably wouldn't have cared about if they had. Let's talk about what Victoria's death meant beyond the obvious. When she died in 1901, people who were in their 60s had never known another monarch. She'd been queen so long that she'd become synonymous with Britain itself, an unchanging fixture in a rapidly changing world. Her death felt like the end of an age because it literally was. The Victorian era ended, and the Edwardian era began. And suddenly all the things that had seemed permanent and eternal were revealed as temporary and contingent, tied to one person's lifespan rather than eternal truths about how the world worked. The mourning for Victoria was genuine, but also performative, which describes most royal occasions. People lined the streets, wore black, expressed grief that ranged from sincere to obligatory. Newspapers published elaborate tributes. Poets wrote commemorative verses. The Empire Victoria had ruled observed moments of silence, not all of them voluntarily. In India, in Africa, in colonies scattered across the world, people were told to mourn a woman they'd never met who'd claimed authority over their lives without their consent. Some mourned sincerely, believing the propaganda about the benevolent empress. Others went through the motions, while privately feeling nothing, or feeling relief that maybe things would change now that she was gone. Things did change, but not in the ways colonized peoples hoped. Edward VII inherited the throne and the empire, and while his personal style was different from his mother's, the structure of imperialism remained intact. Empire wasn't about individual monarchs. It was about systems, institutions, economic extraction, and the military power to enforce British rule regardless of who was wearing the crown. Edward could be charming and cosmopolitan, and enjoy himself thoroughly, and India would still be governed by British officials who answered to London, not to the people they ruled. The Edwardian era 1901 to 1910 is often romanticized as a golden age, a last moment of elegance and optimism before World War I destroyed everything. There's some truth to that, but it's a truth that applies only to the wealthy. For them, the Edwardian era was magnificent. Parties and fashion and technology making life easier while servants did all the actual work. electric lights, telephones, automobiles, all becoming more common among those who could afford them. Travel becoming easier with better ships and eventually airplanes. Though early flight was more dangerous than impressive, fashion changed dramatically from Victorian styles. Women's clothing became slightly less restrictive, waistlines rose, corsets loosened incrementally. Though women were still imprisoned by clothing standards that prioritized appearance over comfort or function. The S-bend corset of the Edwardian era pushed women's bodies into unnatural shapes, thrusting the bust forward and the hips back, creating a silhouette that looks absurd in retrospect, but was considered ideal beauty at the time. Fashion has always been tyranny dressed up as choice. Men's fashion became more standardized, the suit becoming the uniform of respectability for middle and upper class men. Working class men wore variations of the same, cheaper fabrics and less tailoring, but the basic form was similar. The top hat was still worn for formal occasions, but bowler hats became common for everyday wear. Edward himself was fashionable, setting trends and caring deeply about his appearance in ways Victoria had found frivolous, but which made him popular with society. He understood that monarchy was increasingly about appearance and symbolism, so he made sure to appear impressive. The Edwardian era saw continued technological advancement. Automobiles went from expensive curiosities to increasingly common transportation for the wealthy. The first motorized taxis appeared in London. Buses began replacing horse-drawn omnibuses. The streets became louder, more dangerous, and gradually faster. Horses didn't disappear overnight, but their dominance was ending, replaced by machines that didn't need rest or food and could travel faster and farther. Aviation began during the Edwardian era. The Wright brothers flew in 1903, and suddenly the dream of human flight was reality. Within a few years, aviators were setting records, crossing channels, and proving that airplanes could be useful for more than just spectacle. By 1910, there were air shows, aviation enthusiasts, and military officials realizing that airplanes would change warfare. They were right, though they couldn't imagine just how much. Communication technology continued advancing. Wireless telegraphy, radio's predecessor, allowed ships at sea to communicate with land. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912, just after the Edwardian era ended, demonstrated both the importance and limitations of wireless communication. The ship sent distress signals. Other ships received them, but the nearest ship had its wireless operator asleep and didn't respond. Hundreds died who might have been saved with better communication protocols, though ultimately they died because the ship's owners prioritized luxury over sufficient lifeboats, and because nature doesn't care about human arrogance. The Edwardian era also saw growing social tensions that the wealthy largely ignored. Labor movements were gaining strength, trade unions organizing workers who were tired of being exploited. Strikes became more common, more organized, more effective at disrupting production and forcing concessions from owners. The government, controlled by the wealthy, generally sided with owners against workers, sending in troops to break strikes and protect property over people. Class conflict was intensifying, and while the upper classes enjoyed their parties, the working class was preparing to demand their share of the wealth they created. Women's suffrage movements became more militant during the Edwardian era. The suffragettes, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, escalated tactics from peaceful protests to property destruction, hunger strikes, and confrontational demonstrations. They chained themselves to railings, smashed windows, set fires, and generally made themselves impossible to ignore. The government responded with arrests, forced feedings, and the Cat and Mouse Act, which allowed authorities to release hunger strikers when they became too weak to be safe in prison, then rearrest them once they recovered. It was brutal, but it worked in focusing attention on women's disenfranchisement. Edward VII didn't particularly support women's suffrage. He found the suffragettes unladylike and their tactics distasteful. But he also had limited power to stop the movement, and his personal opinions mattered less than the growing pressure for change. Women wouldn't get the vote until after World War I, and even then only women over 30 who met property qualifications, with full equality delayed until 1928. But the groundwork was laid during the Edwardian era, by women willing to suffer for a cause that wouldn't benefit them personally, but would benefit future generations. Ireland remained a problem throughout the Edwardian era, as it had been throughout the Victorian era, and would continue to be through the 20th century and beyond. Home rule. The idea that Ireland should have its own parliament while remaining part of the United Kingdom was debated endlessly. Liberals generally supported it, Conservatives opposed it, and Irish nationalists wanted full independence, not half measures. Ulster Protestants opposed Home Rule violently, threatening civil war if Ireland gained autonomy. The situation was a mess, unresolved when Edward died, and would contribute to the Irish War of Independence, an eventual partition after World War I. Edward VII's foreign policy achievements were real despite limited constitutional power. He was good at personal diplomacy, building relationships with other European leaders through charm and shared aristocratic culture. He helped improve relations with France, contributing to the Entente Cordiale of 1904, which aligned Britain and France after centuries of rivalry. He visited Russia, Germany, and other countries, being visible and personable and making monarchy seem relevant even as its actual power diminished. His nephew Kaiser Wilhelm II was jealous of Edward's popularity and resentful of his influence, which contributed to the tension between Britain and Germany that would explode into World War I. Edward died in May 1910. After a series of heart attacks, he'd lived excessively, smoked constantly, ate enormous meals, and generally ignored his health until his body gave out. He was 68, had been king for 9 years, and left behind a son who'd been well trained for monarchy, but who lacked his father's charm and confidence. George V became king, and the world continued its march toward catastrophe. George V, 1910 to 1936, was dutiful, conservative, and deeply conventional. He'd served in the Navy, understood discipline and hierarchy, and approached monarchy as a job to be done correctly, rather than an opportunity for glamour or self-expression. Where his father had been charismatic, George was stiff. Where Edward had enjoyed high society, George preferred quiet domesticity with his wife Mary. Where Edward had been cosmopolitan, George was deeply, almost aggressively British, despite being descended from Germans like every monarch since George I. George's early reign was marked by constitutional crises and social tensions. The Parliament Act of 1911 limited the House of Lords' power to veto legislation, a reform the Lords opposed but couldn't stop. The Act was necessary because the Lords had been blocking liberal reforms, but it fundamentally changed the balance of power in British government. The monarchy's role became even more ceremonial, and George accepted this with resignation, if not enthusiasm. He understood that constitutional monarchy meant doing what Parliament wanted, while maintaining the appearance of royal authority. Labour unrest intensified during George's early reign. The Great Unrest 1911 to 1914 saw massive strikes by transport workers, miners, and other labourers demanding better wages and conditions. The strikes were often violent, with police and sometimes military forces deployed against strikers. People died in clashes between workers and authorities. The government eventually made some concessions, but the fundamental inequality remained. Britain was wealthy, but that wealth was concentrated among the few while the many struggled. Then came August 1914, and everything changed. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist, setting off a chain reaction of alliances, mobilizations, and ultimatums that escalated into World War I. Britain entered the war in August 1914. Ostensibly to protect Belgian neutrality, but really because the alliance system and fears of German power made war seem inevitable. Millions of men volunteered or were conscripted, told they'd be home by Christmas, sent to France and Belgium, where they died in trenches and artillery barrages, and gas attacks that killed slowly and horribly. World War I was industrial warfare taken to its logical conclusion. Mechanized death on a scale humanity had never seen. Machine guns made frontal assaults suicidal. Artillery killed from miles away. Tanks, a British invention, appeared in 1916 and slowly changed tactics. Airplanes evolved from reconnaissance tools to fighters and bombers. Submarines attacked civilian ships, drowning passengers and crew without warning. Poison gas was used by both sides, causing agonizing deaths and permanent disabilities for survivors. The war was supposed to be glorious, patriotic. An opportunity for heroism, it was actually mechanized slaughter on an industrial scale. George V visited troops, toured hospitals, and tried to maintain morale while watching his country bleed. His cousin Kaiser Wilhelm II led Germany. Victoria's grandson fighting Victoria's great-grandson, family connections meaningless in the face of nationalism and geopolitics. Another cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, led Russia into war and revolution, eventually being murdered with his family by Bolsheviks, who had no patience for monarchical authority or Romanov claims to rule by divine right. The British royal family had a German name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which became increasingly awkward as anti-German sentiment intensified during the war. In 1917, George changed the family name to Windsor, after Windsor Castle, erasing the German heritage that had defined the monarchy since 1714. It was rebranding, but effective rebranding. Suddenly the royal family was British, not German imports. And George could present himself as thoroughly patriotic despite his ancestry. The name stuck, and subsequent monarchs have been Windsors, hiding their German roots under English toponymy. The war dragged on year after year of stalemate and death, 1915, 1916, 1917. Each year bringing more casualties, more grief, more questions about whether any of this was worth it. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote about the horror, the waste, the betrayal of young men by old men who sent them to die for causes that seemed increasingly meaningless. The home fronts suffered too, food shortages, rationing, women taking jobs men had left to fight, social structures straining under the pressure of total war. Russia collapsed into revolution in 1917, overthrowing the Tsar in March, and then overthrowing the provisional government in November, when the Bolsheviks seized power. The Romanovs, George's cousins, were arrested, imprisoned, and eventually executed in July 1918 in Yekaterinburg. The entire family, Tsar Nicholas, Tsarina Alexandra, their 5 children, and several servants, were shot in a basement and buried in unmarked graves. George had refused to offer them asylum in Britain, fearing that hosting his unpopular relatives would destabilize his own position. They died, and he lived, and the guilt probably haunted him, though he never admitted it publicly. America entered the war in 1917, bringing fresh troops and resources that shifted the balance. Germany made one last desperate offensive in spring 1918, gained ground briefly, and then was pushed back as Allied forces counterattacked with American support. By November 1918, Germany was exhausted, its allies had collapsed, and the Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, ending the fighting, but not ending the war's consequences. World War I killed approximately 20 million people, including 9 million combatants. Britain lost nearly 1 million men, an entire generation of young men who would have been fathers, workers, leaders, artists. Every family was touched by loss. Every town had memorials listing names of dead sons. The social and psychological impact was immense, destroying confidence in progress, authority, and the idea that civilization meant anything more than mechanized murder dressed in flags and propaganda. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 officially ended the war, punishing Germany with territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations that crippled its economy and humiliated its people. The treaty created conditions for resentment and revanchism that would contribute to the rise of Nazism and World War II 20 years later. But in 1919, people were too exhausted to care about future consequences. They wanted the war to be over, wanted their sons to come home. wanted life to return to something resembling normal, even though normal was impossible after what they'd experienced. The British Empire actually expanded after World War I, absorbing former German colonies and Ottoman territories under League of Nations mandates. Britain gained control of Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, and parts of Africa, adding to an empire already too large to govern effectively. These acquisitions would prove more burden than benefit, requiring military occupation and creating nationalist movements demanding independence. Empire was dying slowly, but it would take another world war and decades of decolonization before it finally ended. George V's reign continued through the 1920s and 1930s, decades of economic difficulty, social change, and growing international tension. The 1920s saw brief prosperity, followed by the Great Depression, mass unemployment, poverty, and political extremism. The general strike of 1926 saw millions of workers walking off their jobs, paralyzing the country for 9 days before the strike collapsed. George tried to be impartial, but supported the government against strikers, because monarchy always sides with established authority when challenged by popular movements. George's relationship with his children was difficult, continuing the Hanoverian tradition of fathers and sons disappointing each other. His eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, was charming, popular, and completely unsuited for monarchy. He had affairs, avoided duty, and became increasingly attached to Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee who was everything the establishment found unacceptable. George knew Edward would be a disaster as king but couldn't prevent it. Primogeniture meant the eldest son inherited regardless of suitability, which is one of monarchy's fundamental flaws. His second son, Albert, called Bertie, had a stammer that made public speaking agonizing. He was shy, dutiful, and overshadowed by his charismatic older brother. No one expected Bertie to be king. He married Elizabeth Bowes Lyon in 1923, and they had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. Bertie seemed destined for a quiet life as a minor royal, supporting his brother's reign, while raising his family in relative obscurity. Fate had different plans. George's health declined through the 1930s. He had chronic lung problems from years of smoking, weakened further by a serious illness in 1928. By 1936, he was dying, and everyone knew it. He spent his final days at Sandringham, the royal estate in Norfolk, surrounded by family and doctors who could ease his suffering, but not save him. There's a persistent rumor that his doctor hastened his death with a lethal injection of morphine and cocaine to ensure he died in time for the morning newspapers rather than the evening ones, preserving royal dignity through timing. The rumor is probably true, based on the doctor's notes, which reveals something about how monarchy works, appearance and timing mattering more than the actual moment of death. George V died on January 20, 1936, and his son became Edward VIII, which lasted less than a year before the abdication crisis proved George's concerns about his heir were entirely justified. Edward VIII was 41 when he became king, old enough to know better, but apparently incapable of learning. He'd been having an affair with Wallis Simpson since 1934, and he wanted to marry her, despite her being twice divorced and still married to her second husband. The establishment opposed the marriage absolutely. The Church of England, which the king nominally led, opposed divorce and remarriage. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, opposed it. The Dominions opposed it. Public opinion was mixed, but enough people opposed it that Edward's position became impossible. He could be king, or he could marry Wallis, but he couldn't do both. The idea of a morganatic marriage, where Wallis would be Edward's wife but not queen, was proposed and rejected. Edward had to choose. He chose Wallis, abdicating on December 11, 1936, after reigning for 326 days. He gave a radio address explaining his decision, claiming he couldn't continue without the woman he loved by his side. It was romantic or selfish, depending on your perspective. He became Duke of Windsor, married Wallis in France in 1937, and spent the rest of his life as a minor royal in exile, bitter about his treatment and increasingly irrelevant. During World War II, there were concerns about his Nazi sympathies, and he was essentially exiled to the Bahamas as governor to keep him away from Europe and prevent him from causing diplomatic disasters. Edward's abdication meant his brother Bertie became king, taking the name George VI to emphasize continuity with his father. George VI never wanted to be king, was terrified of public speaking because of his stammer, and felt betrayed by his brother for abandoning duty for personal happiness. But he accepted the role because monarchy is about duty, supposedly, and someone had to do the job. His wife Elizabeth supported him, his daughters provided motivation, and his speech therapist Lionel Logue helped him manage his stammer well enough to function publicly. George VI's reign, 1936 to 1952, was defined by World War II, the event that shaped the 20th century more than any other. The war started in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France honored their alliance commitments and declared war on Germany. It was World War I again, except worse, more total, more destructive, with better technology for killing and fewer illusions about glory or heroism. George and Elizabeth stayed in London during the Blitz, the German bombing campaign that targeted British cities from 1940 to 1941. Buckingham Palace was bombed, damaged but not destroyed, and George and Elizabeth used this to present themselves as sharing the people's suffering. Elizabeth famously said she was glad the palace had been bombed because now she could look the East End in the face, referring to the working-class neighbourhoods that had been bombed heavily. It was good public relations, even if the comparison between palace damage and slum destruction was absurd. The royal family became symbols of British resistance during World War II, which is exactly what constitutional monarchy is supposed to do during crises. George gave speeches, visited bombed areas, met with troops, and generally tried to maintain morale while actual military and political leaders conducted the war. Winston Churchill was Prime Minister from 1940 to 1945, and he and George developed a good working relationship, meeting weekly to discuss the war and maintain the appearance of royal involvement in governance. World War II was even more total than World War I, involving every continent, killing approximately 70 to 85 million people, including 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. The war saw the development of radar, jet engines, rockets, and atomic bombs, technology advancing through military necessity. Civilians were targeted deliberately through strategic bombing, siege warfare, and genocide. The rules of war, already weak, broke down completely as both sides prioritized victory over humanity. Britain survived, barely, bankrupted by the war effort and dependent on American support. The British Empire began its final collapse as colonies that had been promised freedom after the war demanded that promise be kept. India gained independence in 1947, partitioned into India and Pakistan in a process that killed perhaps 1 million people in communal violence. Other colonies followed, some peacefully, some after wars of independence that Britain could no longer afford to fight. George VI's health deteriorated after the war. He'd smoked heavily his entire life, and the stress of the war accelerated his decline. He developed lung cancer, though this wasn't publicly acknowledged at the time. He had surgery in 1951 to remove part of his lung, recovered briefly, and then died suddenly in February 1952 at age 56. He'd been king for 16 years, longer than he'd expected, through the worst crisis Britain had faced since the Napoleonic Wars. He'd done his duty, and it had killed him. His daughter Elizabeth became queen at age 25, young, relatively unprepared, but committed to the role in ways that would define the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Elizabeth II's reign, 1952 to 2022, was the longest in British history, 70 years of massive social, political, and technological change. She remained constant while everything else transformed, which was either her greatest strength or evidence of monarchy's irrelevance, depending on who you asked. Elizabeth's reign saw decolonization accelerate, the British Empire dissolving into the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations with no real power but lingering symbolic connections to Britain and the Crown. Dozens of countries gained independence during Elizabeth's reign, from African nations in the 1960s to Caribbean islands to Pacific territories. Some independence movements were peaceful, others violent, but the result was the same: the end of formal empire and the beginning of attempts to maintain influence through softer means. Britain itself changed dramatically during Elizabeth's reign. The class system loosened incrementally. The welfare state expanded, providing healthcare, education, and social support that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Immigration increased, particularly from former colonies, making Britain more diverse and more cosmopolitan, but also creating tensions around identity, belonging, and what it meant to be British. Some embraced multiculturalism, others resented it, and Elizabeth stayed publicly neutral on it all, because constitutional monarchs don't take sides on political issues. The 1960s brought social revolution. At least for young people, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and British rock music conquered the world. Fashion became more expressive and rebellious. Sexual mores loosened with the contraceptive pill and changing attitudes. Young people rejected the conformity and repression of their parents' generation, demanding freedom, peace, and the right to live according to their own values. The establishment, including the monarchy, seemed increasingly out of touch, relics of a past that young people wanted to escape. The Troubles in Northern Ireland, starting in the late 1960s, brought decades of violence, terrorism, and political deadlock. The conflict between Unionists, who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom, and Republicans who wanted a united Ireland, killed over 3,000 people before the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 brought fragile peace. Elizabeth stayed above the conflict publicly, though the monarchy symbolized British authority that Republicans rejected violently. Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten in 1947, a Greek prince with British and German ancestry, another member of Europe's interconnected royal families. He gave up his Greek titles, became Duke of Edinburgh, and spent the next 70 years as royal consort, supporting Elizabeth, making occasional gaffes, and generally being an old-fashioned man uncomfortable with modernity, but committed to duty. They had 4 children, Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward, and their family life was difficult, strained by the demands of royalty and Philip's emotional distance. The monarchy modernized slowly during Elizabeth's reign, sometimes willingly, usually reluctantly. The royal family's finances became slightly more transparent, though still opaque by normal standards. Some palaces opened to tourists, generating revenue and making royalty more accessible. Elizabeth gave her first televised Christmas message in 1957, bringing monarchy into people's homes in new ways. The coronation in 1953 was televised, letting millions watch the ceremony, democratizing access while preserving the ritual's mystique. But the monarchy also resisted change, in ways that made it seem increasingly absurd. The rigid protocol, the bowing and curtsying, the elaborate ceremonies that served no practical purpose, all continued because tradition mattered more than relevance. The cost of maintaining the monarchy, the civil list, and later the sovereign grant, seemed extravagant when public services were underfunded. Republicans questioned why Britain needed a monarchy at all, why one family should receive wealth and privilege purely through birth. The royal family's personal scandals damaged the monarchy's reputation repeatedly. Charles married Diana Spencer in 1981, in a ceremony watched by millions worldwide, seemingly a fairy tale, but actually a disaster. Charles was in love with Camilla Parker Bowles, had been for years, but couldn't marry her because she was divorced and unsuitable. Diana was young, naive, and completely unprepared for royal life. The marriage collapsed publicly, with both parties having affairs, giving interviews, and generally destroying any illusion of royal dignity. Diana's death in August 1997, in a car crash in Paris while fleeing paparazzi, created a crisis for the monarchy. The public mourned intensely, emotionally, filling London with flowers and grief. Elizabeth stayed at Balmoral with her grandsons, following protocol that said personal grief should be private. The public interpreted this as coldness, indifference to Diana, who'd been rejected by the royal family. Pressure mounted for Elizabeth to return to London, to acknowledge the public's grief, to show emotion. She eventually did, giving a televised address and returning to London. But the damage to the monarchy's reputation was real. Charles eventually married Camilla in 2005, making official what had been true for decades. They were happy together, having found each other again after years apart. But the public never embraced Camilla the way they'd embraced Diana. She'd always be the other woman, the person who'd contributed to Diana's unhappiness, regardless of Charles's equal or greater culpability. Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein, the financier and sex offender, damaged the monarchy further. Andrew gave a disastrous interview in 2019, attempting to explain his friendship with Epstein, when failing so spectacularly that he had to withdraw from public duties. His reputation was destroyed, and the monarchy's reputation suffered by association. Hereditary privilege meant Andrew remained a prince, remained wealthy, remained protected by his family, even though he'd proven himself unworthy of respect. Elizabeth navigated all of this with remarkable consistency, rarely showing emotion publicly, performing her duties regardless of personal feelings, embodying the idea that monarchy is about duty rather than personal happiness. She met with prime ministers weekly, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, 13 of them total across 7 decades. She travelled extensively, visited over 100 countries, and maintained the Commonwealth connections that were her particular interest. She adapted to technology, eventually understanding that monarchy needed to be visible to remain relevant, even if visibility meant less mystique. She died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, aged 96, ending a reign that had started when Britain still had an empire and ending when Britain was a medium-sized European nation struggling with its identity and purpose after Brexit. Her death prompted genuine grief, mixed with uncertainty about the monarchy's future. Charles became Charles III at age 73, the oldest person to ever become British monarch, and immediately faced questions about how long he'd reign and whether the monarchy would survive into his son William's reign. Charles III represents everything complicated about modern monarchy. He spent his entire life waiting for a job that requires no qualifications beyond birth. He's intelligent, interested in architecture, organic farming, and environmental issues, but also prone to interfering in politics in ways constitutional monarchs shouldn't. He was catastrophically bad at his first marriage, better at his second, and remains somewhat unpopular despite being king. He'll reign until he dies, then William will inherit, then George, Charles's grandson, will eventually become king. Continuing a system that seems increasingly absurd the more you examine it. But monarchy persists because people want it to persist. Or at least enough people want it that abolishing it seems more trouble than it's worth. It's comforting to have continuity, tradition, someone who embodies the nation without being involved in daily politics. It's expensive, certainly, and unfair, absolutely. But so are many institutions humans maintain, because they provide psychological comfort, or symbolic meaning. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves, and monarchy is one of those stories, a narrative about history, stability, and connection to the past. The alternative, a republic with an elected president, seems too American or too French, not British enough for a country that defines itself partly through its peculiar institutions. A president would have political affiliations, would be divisive, would lack the historical continuity that monarchy provides. Or at least that's the argument monarchy's defenders make. Republicans argue that democracy means choosing leaders, that birth should never determine authority, that the money spent on royalty could fund hospitals, schools, and services that actually benefit people. Both arguments have merit, which is why the debate continues without resolution. Britain muddles through, keeping the monarchy while limiting its power, paying for palaces while cutting social services, celebrating royal weddings while homeless people sleep in the streets. It's contradiction and hypocrisy, but so is every political system. Every society that claims values it doesn't fully practice. And that brings us back to the Victorian era, the period we started with, when Victoria reigned, and there were no kings except in the historical sense of the kings who'd come before and the kings who'd come after. The Victorian era created modern Britain in many ways: industrialization, empire, social reform, scientific advancement, all accelerating during Victoria's 63-year reign. But it also created the problems modern Britain still faces: inequality, imperial legacy, rigid class structures, and the unresolved question of what Britain is supposed to be now that empire is gone and the certainties of the past have dissolved. Victoria herself would probably be appalled by modern Britain, by the social changes, the diversity, the rejection of the values she held sacred. She'd hate that women have full political rights, that the monarchy has so little power, that her empire has dissolved into dozens of independent nations that don't answer to London. But she'd also recognize some continuities: the persistence of monarchy despite its declining relevance, the class structures that remain despite democratization, the British tendency to maintain traditions long after their original purposes have disappeared, the kings who came before Victoria, those Hanoverians who stumbled into ruling England despite not wanting to be there, established the pattern of limited monarchy that Victoria inherited and that Elizabeth II perfected. They gave up power gradually, sometimes willingly, usually under pressure, creating the constitutional monarchy that Britain has today. They were mostly mediocre men doing a job they'd inherited, making mistakes, having dysfunctional families, and generally proving that birth doesn't determine competence or wisdom. The kings who came after Victoria, Edward VII through George VI to Charles III, continued that pattern, adapting monarchy to changing times, giving up more power, becoming more symbolic and less powerful, surviving through flexibility rather than strength. They proved that monarchy could persist even when its original justifications, divine right, military leadership, political authority, had all disappeared. Monarchy became theatre, performance, symbolism, and apparently that's enough to maintain it. So if you ask me, after all these words, whether there were kings during the Victorian era, I'd say no, technically, because Victoria was queen and Albert was merely prince consort. But I'd also say yes, meaningfully, because kingship and monarchy aren't just about who wears a crown, but about systems of power, traditions of authority, and the long shadow that the past casts over the present. The kings before and after Victoria shaped her reign and the era named for her. Even though they weren't present during it, history isn't clean, isn't simple, and resists the neat categorizations we try to impose on it. It's messy, human, contradictory, full of people making decisions for complicated reasons with unintended consequences that echo through time in unexpected ways. The Victorian era and its non-existent kings exemplify this messiness, this contradiction between what we think we know and what actually happened, between the stories we tell ourselves and the more complicated reality underneath. And maybe that's the real lesson here, if there is one, which there probably isn't, because history doesn't offer lessons so much as examples of what happened before, which may or may not apply to what's happening now. We inherit systems from the past, monarchies and democracies and everything in between, and we adapt them or maintain them or eventually replace them. But we're always building on what came before, shaped by decisions people made decades or centuries ago for reasons that made sense to them, even if they seem absurd to us. The British monarchy will probably continue, at least for a while, because enough people want it to continue, and because ending it would require more political will than currently exists. Charles will reign until he dies, William will inherit, and probably George after him, and maybe eventually Britain will decide monarchy is too absurd to maintain and will become a republic, or maybe monarchy will adapt again, become even less powerful and more symbolic, existing purely as ceremonial theatre that comforts people who want connection to the past. Either way, this is the history of Victorian kings who didn't exist, except in the sense that all history exists in the present, shaping us whether we acknowledge it or not, connecting us to people we never met who made choices that determined the world we inherited. Victoria reigned for 63 years over an empire and an age, and when she died, the world changed, but also stayed the same, because change and continuity exist simultaneously, contradicting each other while both being true. We're all living in the aftermath of decisions made by people who are dead, inheriting their systems and institutions, trying to make sense of traditions whose original purposes we've forgotten, but which we maintain anyway, because they're familiar, because they connect us to history, because humans need stories and symbols and connections to something larger than ourselves. Monarchy provides that, even when it's absurd, even when it's unfair, even when we know better, but choose to maintain it anyway. And that's probably as close to a conclusion as we're going to get, because history doesn't conclude. It just continues, one generation after another, making mistakes and occasional progress, building on what came before, while trying to create something better, succeeding sometimes, failing often, but persisting because that's what humans do. We persist, we adapt. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, and where we came from, and where we're going, even when those stories are more fiction than fact, more aspiration than reality, more what we wish were true than what actually is.